a country smaller than New York City. No oil. No gold. No natural resources. 50 years ago, it had swampland, slums, and almost no fresh water. Today, it has a higher average wealth per person than the United States, Germany, and Japan combined by comparison. This is the story of how Singapore quietly became one of the richest places on earth, and why almost nobody outside of it understands how. When people picture the world's richest nations, they imagine oil kingdoms in the Middle East, or economic giants like America and China. Singapore rarely enters the conversation. It's a city-state roughly the size of a mid-sized city, with no natural resources, no oil reserves, and a population smaller than New York's. And yet, by several measures of wealth, GDP per capita, foreign reserves, sovereign wealth, and financial infrastructure, Singapore quietly outperforms nearly every country on the planet. In this documentary, we're going to break down exactly how this happened. Not through luck. Not through natural resources. But through a series of calculated, sometimes brutal, decisions that transformed a struggling port town into a global financial fortress. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Singapore isn't just rich, it's structured to stay rich, long after other economies stumble. Point 1. The unlikely beginning. To understand Singapore's wealth today, we have to go back to 1965, a year most people don't associate with economic miracles, but with desperation. Singapore had just been expelled from Malaysia. It had no army, no natural resources, overcrowded slums, and unemployment above 10%. Freshwater had to be imported. There was no domestic market big enough to sustain an economy. By almost every conventional measure, Singapore should have failed. Its first Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, later admitted that many economists at the time believed Singapore had no viable path to survival, let alone prosperity. But instead of trying to compete the way larger nations did, through agriculture, heavy industry, or natural resources, Singapore's leadership made an unusual bet: they would turn the country's biggest weakness, its lack of resources, into a strategic advantage. They asked a different question. Not, what can we produce? But, what can we become? And the answer reshaped the next 50 years. Point 2. Turning location into leverage. Singapore sits at the crossroads of the Strait of Malacca, one of the busiest shipping routes on Earth. Nearly a quarter of the world's traded goods pass through these waters. For centuries, this location was just a geographic fact. Singapore's leadership turned it into an economic weapon. Instead of taxing trade heavily like neighboring countries did, Singapore did the opposite. It became one of the first major free ports in Asia, welcoming shipping, refining, and logistics companies with minimal restrictions. While competitors imposed tariffs and bureaucracy, Singapore made itself the easiest place in the region to do business. This single decision triggered a chain reaction. Shipping companies came for the low friction. Oil refineries followed the shipping traffic. Manufacturers followed the refineries. And soon, an entire ecosystem of global trade infrastructure had planted itself on this tiny island, not because Singapore had resources, but because Singapore had made itself indispensable to everyone else's supply chain. Today, the port of Singapore is one of the busiest transshipment hubs in the world, and Singapore Changi Airport is consistently ranked among the best-connected air cargo hubs on the planet. The country didn't just participate in global trade. It made itself an unavoidable checkpoint for it. Point 3. The financial fortress. Trade brought Singapore its first wave of wealth. But what really cemented its economic power was a much quieter transformation, becoming a global financial hub. Starting in the 1970s, Singapore's government aggressively courted international banks by offering political stability, low taxes, strict rule of law, and minimal corruption, a combination that was, and still is, rare in the region. While many neighboring economies experienced political instability or unpredictable regulation, Singapore built a reputation as the one place in Asia where money was safe. This mattered enormously. Wealthy individuals, multinational corporations, and institutional investors don't just chase high returns, they chase safety and predictability. Singapore offered both, and the money followed. Over the following decades, Singapore developed one of the most sophisticated banking and asset management sectors in the world. Global banks set up regional headquarters there. Wealth managers opened offices to serve ultra-high net worth clients from across Asia. And crucially, Singapore's government itself became an active financial player, not just a host for foreign capital. This leads us to one of the least understood parts of Singapore's wealth story: its sovereign wealth funds. Point 4. The secret wealth machines. Most people have heard of oil-rich nations having massive sovereign wealth funds. Very few realize Singapore, a country with no oil, runs two of the largest and most secretive sovereign wealth funds on earth, GIC and Temasek holdings. These aren't small investment vehicles. Combined, their assets under management are estimated to be worth hundreds of billions of dollars, with some estimates placing their combined holdings well above $1 trillion when accounting for both entities' global portfolios. They invest in real estate, technology companies, infrastructure, and public equities across the globe, from Silicon Valley startups to European real estate to African infrastructure projects. Here's what makes this so remarkable. This money didn't come from natural resources. It came from disciplined, decades-long reinvestment of trade surpluses, foreign reserves, and government savings. Instead of spending its wealth as it came in, Singapore's government systematically invested it, treating the entire country almost like a long-term investment portfolio rather than a typical national economy. This is a crucial distinction between Singapore and many resource-rich nations. Oil-rich countries often experience what economists call the resource curse, sudden wealth that gets spent rather than invested, leaving the country vulnerable when prices crash. Singapore never had that luxury of easy wealth, so it never developed that habit. Every dollar had to be deliberately allocated, invested, and multiplied. Section 5. The Human Capital Bet. If trade and finance were Singapore's engines, its people were the fuel. With no natural resources to fall back on, Singapore's government made an aggressive, almost obsessive bet on human capital. Education became a national priority, with rigorous standards that consistently place Singaporean students among the top performers in international assessments in math and science. But it wasn't just about test scores. The government built entire pipelines connecting education directly to the needs of a modern economy: engineering, finance, biotechnology, and advanced manufacturing. At the same time, Singapore pursued an aggressive strategy of attracting global talent. Skilled professionals from around the world were welcomed with clear, efficient immigration pathways, turning Singapore into a magnet for expertise that many larger, more resource-rich countries struggled to attract due to bureaucracy or instability. This created a powerful compounding effect. Educated locals plus imported global talent equals a workforce capable of competing directly with far larger economies. Not through cheap labor, but through high-value expertise in finance, technology, and specialized manufacturing. Point 6. The uncomfortable trade-offs. It would be dishonest to tell this story without acknowledging the costs. Singapore's rise wasn't purely a feel-good tale of visionary planning, it involved real trade-offs that are still debated today. Political freedoms were significantly restricted for decades, with strict controls on press freedom and political opposition. Housing, while remarkably efficient through the government's public housing program, involved massive government control over where and how people lived. Personal freedoms that citizens in Western democracies take for granted, from chewing gum sales to strict social conduct laws, were curtailed in the name of order and stability. There's also a wealth distribution question that often gets lost in Singapore's success story. While the country's headline wealth statistics are staggering, income inequality remains a real issue, and the cost of living, particularly housing and vehicle ownership, is among the highest in the world for ordinary residents. Understanding Singapore's wealth means understanding that it wasn't built through pure free market chaos, nor through Scandinavian-style social democracy. It was built through what analysts often describe as a hybrid model. Aggressive free market economics paired with heavy-handed state control, a formula that produced extraordinary wealth, but one that comes with real and ongoing debates about freedom, fairness, and sustainability. Point 7. Why this matters now. So why does any of this matter today, decades after these decisions were made? Because Singapore represents a case study that challenges a core assumption most people carry about national wealth, that natural resources, land size, or population are the primary drivers of prosperity. Singapore proves that strategic positioning, financial discipline, education, and governance can outweigh nearly every traditional advantage other nations rely on. As the global economy shifts toward finance, technology, and services rather than raw materials, Singapore's model becomes increasingly relevant, not just as a curiosity, but as a blueprint that other nations, and even cities, are now trying to study and replicate, from Dubai to parts of Southeast Asia. The uncomfortable question this raises is simple: if a nation this small, this resource-poor, and this vulnerable could engineer this level of prosperity through deliberate choices, what does that say about the countries that had every natural advantage, and still didn't get there? Singapore isn't rich by accident, and it isn't rich because of what lies beneath its ground. It's rich because of what its leaders decided to build on top of it: a financial fortress, a trade choke point, a magnet for talent, and a government that treated national wealth like a long-term investment rather than a resource to be consumed. It's a story with real complexity, impressive achievements sitting alongside real trade-offs in freedom and equality. But whether you admire the model or question its costs, one thing is undeniable: Singapore rewrote the rules of what a small nation with nothing could become. If this changed the way you think about wealth and what actually builds it, hit subscribe, because we're breaking down the hidden economics behind the world's most surprising success stories every week. Drop a comment: which country do you want us to expose next? And if you learned something new today, share this with someone who thinks Singapore is just a small country. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.